All right, so I'm so excited to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Kellie Brown, and to facilitate the launch of her new book, The Sound of Hope: Music as Solace, Resistance, and Salvation During the Holocaust and World War II, which is now available for sale through your favorite book retailer. Dr. Brown serves as our professor of music at Milligan. She also holds these many positions, such as chair of the music department, professor of music, and conductor of the Milligan Orchestra. She's a frequent clinician and performer throughout the country and serves as the assistant conductor and associate concertmaster of the Johnson City Symphony Orchestra. In addition to her performing and teaching, Dr. Brown is an accomplished writer and researcher. She is recognized as an authority on music during the Holocaust and frequently speaks throughout the United States at academic institutions and conferences. Her latest book reflects 20 years of research on that subject. Welcome, Kellie.
Thank you, Alicia, and thanks to Mary and all those at Milligan who've helped make this possible. Good evening, everybody. I'm so thrilled you could join us. I had no idea that my book was going to release during a global pandemic. It's not the kind of release that I had thought about, but I'm so thankful for the technology that actually has enabled more of us to gather together tonight from all over the country. So I really appreciate you being here, and hopefully there'll be a time where we can safely gather in person.
So Kellie, to get started, tell us about the basic premise of The Sound of Hope. What was your inspiration, your motivation for spending so many years researching this topic?
Okay, I'm gonna share my screen here. Really, the basic premise is the power of music, how powerful music is in the human heart and the human soul. And I have two quotes that I like to use. One is from the 19th century French novelist Victor Hugo. Music expresses that which cannot be put into words and that which cannot remain silent. That's certainly true. And even the grumpy German philosopher Nietzsche says that music unites all qualities. It can exalt us, divert us, cheer us up, and break the hardest of hearts. So that's sort of the premise behind it. And because music is so powerful, it can be used for good and it can also be used for bad. When we look at the Third Reich and also when we look at Stalin, we see music being used as a weapon, music being used to manipulate and to control. But then we also know of music as a way to bring comfort, as a form of spiritual resistance, and even in some cases to save lives. So the book is organized really around personal narrative, people's stories, and also at the same time, side by side, stories of places, cities and camps and ghettos and concert halls. The stories of people in these places are interwoven together. They're inseparable from each other. People always ask me, about the motivation. This is such a difficult subject to read and research and be immersed in all the time. And you can't avoid the atrocities, and we don't want to. We want to remember. It's important that we do. But what I try to do in my research and my writing and my speaking is to balance the hopeful with the horrific so that we see that. I'm also wanting to bear witness to what has happened. So many of the eyewitnesses to this are no longer with us. And so it's up to the next generation. I say it a little bit more eloquently in my preface, so I'll read you the last paragraph of my preface. During my more than 20 years of research, I have become increasingly grateful for the people whose lives I have described in these chapters. They have taught me that music holds the power to uplift the human spirit and to triumph over oppression, even amid incredible tragedy and suffering. I hope that their testimony can serve as a reminder for our world of what hatred and prejudice can lead to, and of how vital the arts remain in understanding the human condition and in spreading peace and goodness on a global scale. Finally, I pray that I have brought honor to their memories as I have undertaken the holy calling of bearing witness to these stories and lifting back the folds of darkness to reveal moments of light and beauty, to discover where grace abounds. So at the beginning of the book, I talk a lot about the cultural agenda of the Third Reich. Anytime you have totalitarian control, one of the givens is that they're going to censor the arts and media. It's in that how-to manual for dictators, right? Go after the artists, the writers, go after the media. So just in the same way that the Nazis categorized people, decided, okay, these people are superior, these Aryans are superior, these people are inferior, they're subhuman. In the same way that they did that, they also classified music. They decided, here is music that is good. It was good German music, so Beethoven, Wagner, Strauss. And then they labeled another kind of music Entartete Musik, which means degenerate music. So what fell into the degenerate category would have been anything written by a Jewish composer, so like music of Mendelssohn. Jazz, because jazz performers were primarily either African American in origin or from Jewish heritage, like Benny Goodman. They also labeled degenerate any kind of experimental modern classical music, so anything that was atonal or expressionist. So if you think Schoenberg. So all of that music was banned. It was banned from the concert halls. It was banned from being aired on the radio. It was banned from being sold in stores. The other part that was banned would be all Jewish performers. So in any territory that the Reich conquered, immediately these Jewish musicians and music teachers were all fired from their positions. And so now their music is banned. So they can't play Beethoven and it'd be okay. They can't have any of their recordings aired on the radio. They can't have any of their recordings sold or distributed. And they even made a directory that had all of the band musicians in it, and they would circulate it to concert managers and radio stations just to make sure that everybody was staying in compliance with this censorship mandate. And I just can't tell you what kind of an impact something like that had on the culture of the time. So I'll read a little excerpt about that. The damage to German music by Nazi policy, censorship, and propaganda resulted in the unmooring of a once vibrant culture. As Hitler began the process of removing Jews and their contributions from the musical sphere of Germany, it became the equivalent of amputating a limb, cutting off something fundamental. The incalculable loss of Jewish musicians created an immediate and lasting hardship, and their departure signaled the forfeiture of tradition and connection, as Jewish musicians disappeared physically from the stage. And the music of Jewish composers such as Felix Mendelssohn faded from concert programs. Thus, it achieved the total exclusion of Jewish musicians and Jewish music, even down to the sonic level. So the first musician that I learned about related to the Holocaust was Alma Rosé. Alma Rosé came from a very famous musical family in Vienna. Her uncle was Gustav Mahler. Her father was one of the most well-known violinists of the time. Arnold Rosé was the concertmaster of the Vienna Philharmonic. So Alma had this fabulous musical heritage. She lived a fascinating life until the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria in 1938. And then immediately she and her father were on this banned list. They couldn't perform anymore. They couldn't teach. And through some unbelievable circumstances, they ended up escaping to England. But this once wealthy family was now destitute. They had to leave everything behind. So Alma was trying to find work, and she heard that there was an opportunity in Holland. And she thought, well, I think Holland will be a safe place to go. And if you know the history, you know that it wasn't a safe place. And so while she was in Holland, the Nazis invaded and she was trapped there, and she was arrested. And she was sent to Auschwitz. And it was when she was at Auschwitz that she discovered that there were orchestras there. There were orchestras of prisoners, and this wasn't something unusual. The large concentration camps had prisoner orchestras. It was forced music labor. The SS forced these prisoner musicians to become really part of the machinery of the genocide. And the orchestras had several functions. One was purely utilitarian. They provided music for the marching in the morning of prisoners to their work details and marching on the way back in. They also were there to entertain the SS, to give concerts. And then they were used also for a more dark psychological manipulation, in which the orchestras were sometimes set up near the railroad tracks or near the gas chambers so that new arrivals would see the orchestra and be lulled into a sense that maybe they've arrived in a place that's not so bad. Maybe they don't need to resist what's going on. There are no photos of the women's orchestra, but we do have this drawing here made by a prisoner. Because of Alma Rosé's musical pedigree, when she got there, she was put in charge of conducting the women's orchestra. Now, the men's orchestra in Auschwitz was a really large orchestra. They had 120 members. Most of them had been professional musicians. But the women's orchestra struggled with numbers, mostly because women were not allowed to play in the professional orchestras during this time period. So they thought that Alma would be able to grow and improve this fledgling orchestra. And so what she began to do is she realized that she could save lives by getting women into this group. Because what would happen is they were useful. Their music was desired, so she could lobby for a little bit extra food. They practiced instead of going outside and doing the hard labor. Their conditions were still horrible, and they were so malnourished, but they had a chance to live. And thanks to Alma and her interventions, almost all of them survived to see the end of the war. Sadly, Alma herself did not. So I spent a lot of time in my book talking about the different musicians who were in the orchestra at Auschwitz, including Anita. Anita was sent to Auschwitz when she was 16 years old. And when she was at the intake where they shave your head and tattoo your arm, she told someone that she played the cello, and they said, "You'll be saved." And they went and got Alma Rosé, and she gave her an invitation to join the orchestra. And it was an invitation to life. And I'm so happy to tell you that Anita is still alive. She is the only member of the women's orchestra that is still living. She celebrated her 95th birthday last week. It's so amazing. But you know what? It's not always easy to survive. She has had to bear witness for over 70 years about what was done to her. She has had to look at that tattoo on her arm for over 70 years. And when I talked to her in 2018, I could just see the weariness in her from all of these years of bearing witness. And I'll just give you Anita's own words here about what it's like and how hard it is to speak about the unspeakable things. I feel humiliated on behalf of the millions of the dead, and I also feel guilty. It's the age-old guilt of survivors who wonder why they should be in a position to talk at all. The millions who were murdered rely on those survivors to bear witness to their existence. To some extent, that helps to expiate the guilt many of us feel at having survived. While much of my book deals with the fate of Jewish musicians, there are also other examples of the power of music during the war. Olivier Messiaen was a French composer. He was a child prodigy. He was one of the greatest organists in Paris during this time, also a renowned composer. But he was drafted into the French army, and not long after he was drafted, he was captured and became a POW. He was sent to this German POW camp called Stalag VIIIA. And while he was in the camp, Messiaen just continued to compose, and he also befriended 3 other musicians who were in the camp. I've just found consistently in my research that no matter what the circumstances, no matter what place people are, the musicians are drawn to each other. They seek each other out. They can't do otherwise. They make music. So Messiaen was a devout Catholic, and he was really interested in the imagery, the apocalyptic imagery that we see in the book of Revelation. So while he was in Stalag VIIIA, he began to compose what would become his most well-known work called the Quartet for the End of Time. You know, he was living in what felt like apocalyptic times, this global war. And so he decided to write this piece of chamber music. It was for piano, violin, cello, and clarinet. And he was inspired by a verse of scripture from the book of Revelation. And let me find that scripture. And the angel which I saw stand upon the sea and upon the earth lifted up his hand to heaven and swear by him that liveth forever and ever, that there should be time no longer. And so that was his inspiration for the quartet for the end of time. And it premiered. I mean, what a world premiere to happen inside of a POW camp. This is an image of the actual poster that they made within the camp to advertise they were having this concert. Prisoners bought tickets. Also, German guards were present. And for so many people, it was a life-changing experience to hear this piece of music. So in my book, I traced the lives of all 4 of these musicians during this time and then what happened to them after the war. Messiaen was not the only talented musician in the camp, or his group was not the only group. There was an orchestra. Ferdinand Karajan, who was a Belgian POW, was the conductor. And my friend Sonia's father, Max Becker, who had been a talented violinist in Vilna, was a POW here, and he's seated as the concertmaster of this orchestra. So moving on to another composer, you know, like Messiaen, Shostakovich was really impacted by the war, but in a different way. Shostakovich was a child prodigy. He was fabulous pianist and a composer, but he lived his life under the tyranny of Stalin. So during what we call the Great Terror or the Great Purge of Stalin, you know, the artists and the writers were just being arrested and they were being sent to Siberia, or oftentimes they just disappeared and nobody knew what happened to them. Shostakovich was so worried and really thought that his arrest was any day that he took to sleeping out on the landing outside of his apartment with his packed suitcase, so that when they came for him, they wouldn't go inside the apartment and disturb his wife and children. So Hitler and Stalin had made this non-aggression treaty, this pact. And Hitler had no intentions of actually keeping this pact that he made. He was duping Stalin on this. And what happened then in the summer of 1941 is the Nazis invaded Russia. And so the hometown of Shostakovich, Leningrad, then became the scene of the worst siege that had been known at that time in human history. The Germans surrounded Leningrad and they decided to just kill all the people there by just starving them to death. And they were under siege for 880 days. The only longer siege happened later in the 1990s, the siege in Sarajevo, which lasted over 1,400 days. So during the middle of this siege, Shostakovich had not evacuated and he was sort of stuck here. And he began to compose his 7th symphony. And right away it took on the nickname of the Leningrad Symphony. And it was really a musical rallying cry to defend Mother Russia, to stand up against these invaders. And so the Soviet government right away thought, you know what? We can use this. We can use this for propaganda. We need help, because they were losing the war terribly from day one. And they wanted help from the United States. And so they thought, we can get Shostakovich evacuated. He can finish this symphony. We're going to play it all over the world. And we're going to turn public opinion toward helping the Russians. And so they did evacuate him. And he finished the work 2 days after Christmas in 1941. But meanwhile, Leningrad was unbelievable. The people had no food. They were so desperate that they were peeling wallpaper off the wall and boiling it to try to get nutrients out of the paste. They were taking furniture apart to see if they could get any glue from the joints. And they were eating lipstick. Anything they could find, shoe leather, they were trying to eat it. And by the time that winter really sets in and they have no electricity, they have nothing to fuel, for heat. The death count in Leningrad was about 10,000 a day. The temperature was hovering at minus 40 degrees. And so there was no food and there was no heat. So Shostakovich does finish this work and it begins to premiere in Moscow and all over, and including in the United States, and it does work. The United States begins to send some relief, money and supplies to the Soviet Union, but meanwhile, Shostakovich really wants this piece to be played in his beloved Leningrad, but they can't figure out any way to make that possible with the conditions there. But then in March, the Soviet government called on 35-year-old conductor Karl Eliasberg, who was the only conductor really still alive in Leningrad. And they said, we want you to go out and try to find some musicians. And so he did. He went around to see how many musicians were still alive. And they said, we want you to premiere the 7th Symphony on August 9th. And so he scheduled a rehearsal. And it was scheduled to last 3 hours, and it lasted 15 minutes. That's all that these weakened musicians had the energy to do. 15 minutes, despite his pleas that said, friends, I know we are weak, but we must begin the work. And so really this chapter becomes more about these courageous musicians who had to sit on cushions because they were so thin that it was too painful to sit on their bones. And so they had this courage and they brought this music to their city. Eliasberg really helped he lobbied with the Soviet government, said, I need feeding stations for these musicians. They're dying. And he lobbied to help them, even though he was so weak himself that he had to be pulled on a sled to rehearsal. He was not able to walk. And one day, as he was being pulled on the sled, he looked over and he saw a pile of bodies on the side of the road. And this was common. The ground was frozen. Nobody could be buried. There were so many dead. And he saw his percussionist from the orchestra laying in this pile of bodies. And he got up and he went over there and looked, and he saw a few fingers twitching. And he said, he's still alive. And he called for help, and they got him out of the pile, and they took him to a feeding station, and he lived. So these are some of the incredible things that were happening. So finally we get to August 9th. It's the 335th day of the siege. And there are loudspeakers set up all over the city. And normally they're receiving information from the government through there, but now they're going to broadcast this concert. They've sold tickets. People have bartered what precious food they might have left because they want to hear this powerful music. So it not only is being played to those inside, but to the whole city, and it's also being broadcast to the German soldiers who have their city surrounded. It made such an impact on the audience and musicians. I'll read to you the words of one of the clarinet players who was in this premiere. The concert itself, it was our answer to the suffering. I have seen it in my sleep many times. I still hear the thunder of applause from the audience. That will be the last image before my eyes when I die. After this concert, the siege was not over. The siege continued on for another year and a half. At the end of the siege, Leningrad had lost 1.5 million people. But something changed the night of the concert. And they knew it, and the German troops who had heard the music, they knew it. 50 years later, there was an anniversary concert, and there were 8 members of the original orchestra still alive. And this is what the oboe player said. So many years have passed since that day, and memory is a funny thing, like drying paint. It changes color as it dries. But that symphony has stayed with me the way it was that night. Afterwards, it was still a city under siege, but I knew it would live. Music is life, after all. What is life without music? This was the music that proved our city had come back to life after death. I want to share one more story with you. There's so many stories in my book and just courageous people. It's hard to narrow it down, but I didn't want to end without talking about the remarkable Alice Hertz Summer. A native of Prague, she was a child prodigy, a fabulous pianist. When the Reich invaded Czechoslovakia, she and her mother and her husband and her 6-year-old son, Rafi, were sent to Terezín. Terezín is the name in Czech. The Germans called it Theresienstadt. It was a little bit unusual. It was a garrison town that they sort of transformed into a ghetto, but it functioned like a concentration camp. And it was designed really for all of the artists, the writers, the members of the Czech intelligentsia. So an unbelievable group of people were sent here, the most famous conductors and composers and musicians and artists. It was just unbelievable. And so spontaneously, art and music happened. They couldn't be without it. they refused to be without it. One cellist, when he knew he was being deported and he was packing that small suitcase he was allowed to take with him, he took his cello and he broke it into different pieces. He took it apart and he packed the pieces and hid them amongst his clothes. And he put a bottle of glue in there. And when he got to the camp, he reassembled and glued his cello back together. That's how much music meant to them. One of the composers that was in the camp at Terezín was Victor Ullmann. He was probably the most prolific, I think, of composers in the camp. He wrote 20 different works while he was in Terezín, including a full-length opera. And when he was talking about their necessity for music, here's what he said. By no means did we sit weeping on the banks of the waters of Babylon. Our endeavor with respect to art was commensurate with our will to live. When you're reading about Terezín, one of the great tragedies of it is just how many children were in this particular camp. But the artists and the writers, they just embraced these children and they wanted to help them. They wanted to give them things to do. One of the composers named Hans Krasse had written a children's opera called Brundabar before the war. And so he decided to restage in the camp this opera to give the children something to do. Alice's son Rafi was in the cast. He was the sparrow. You can see him on your far left. He's standing up on a box. He was the youngest member of the cast. These children performed an amazing 55 times. Brundabar was just a fabulous experience for them despite the deprivation that they were living in. And it was a welcome distraction. But soon the Nazis saw all this great music that was happening and they decided that it could be an effective propaganda tool. They decided to make a documentary film to show the world how well they were treating the Jews. They decided to do a beautification project in the camp to make it look like they wanted it to for the film. And so part of this beautification project meant sending almost 8,000 of the old and infirm to the gas chambers of Auschwitz. So they brought in special clothing for people to wear. They also set this stage for the Red Cross. The Red Cross wanted to come and visit. They were going to send a delegation of 3 people. And so music and this whole staged charade became part of that. And so Brundabar had a command performance, which is where this photo comes from. Almost all of the children who participated in Brundabar were sent to Auschwitz. Terezín contains really just some of the most amazing stories of the power of music, how it sustained people, how it gave them an opportunity for spiritual resistance. And among the stories of all these different performers and pieces they performed, I continue to weave through the story of Alice and Rafi. Alice was such an important figure in the musical life of Terezín. She gave 100 piano recitals, all from memory. She gave educational concerts for the children. And education was forbidden, but she taught piano lessons in secret to the children. Both Alice and Rafi survived. And when people asked her after the war how she found the strength to make music in these awful situations, she would always reply, music was life. We could not, we would not give up. At 110, Alice became the oldest known Holocaust survivor. And even at this advanced age, she continued to practice the piano several hours a day. At this point, people asked her, how she had been able to deal with all of these years about what had happened to her, the years of her life that had been stolen. How did she deal with the murder of her mother and her husband in the camp? And this is what Alice replied. Every day is a miracle. No matter how bad my circumstances, I have the freedom to choose my attitude to life, even to find joy. Evil is not new. It is up to us how we deal with both good and bad. No one can take this power away from us. Very wise words.
Ooh, yes. I find this tension between the life and hope of music, but then also it being used, as you mentioned, kind of as propaganda and ways to control people. Very, very intriguing. I personally can't wait to read this book. But I also see, and I see in some of our comments, some people noting, what wonderful words for us today too. And so I wonder, do you think, what message does your book have for us today? Almost, well over half a century later.
Right. And so as I was saying at the beginning, how I didn't think that my book would get released in a pandemic. And there's so much else happening in our world right now that troubles us, so much injustice. And so I think these stories, this book is a warning to us, and I think it's a call to action. I think that we need to respond quickly when we see a certain group of people being set aside as different, being made scapegoats for all of our problems. I think that we need to be constantly correcting our course so that our moral compass is always pointing toward justice. Mm. I'm reminded when we think about that of the eternal flame that burns in the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. If you've been there, you might have seen the eternal flame. And the base on which it sits has a verse from the book of Deuteronomy, and it says this: only guard yourself and guard your soul carefully, lest you forget the things your eyes saw, and lest these things depart your heart all the days of your life, and you shall make them known to your children and to your children's children. So I think this is still a call to action for us personally and for the education of our future generations.
Absolutely. A question from Charlotte Anderson. What came first for you, Alma Rosé and violinist, or an interest in the Holocaust and concentration camps?
Hi, Charlotte. Thanks for joining us tonight. It's great to see so many friends here. I would have to say that when I look back over how I got to where I am today, I see God's hand in the whole thing. That along the way, there were all of these seeds that were planted that eventually led to this. Of course, all my years of studying music, piano, and then violin, and then in high school, I had some English teachers that really believed in me and encouraged my writing. Then when I was a freshman at Furman University, I had this wonderful German teacher, and I just fell in love with the German language. And so that sparked an interest to me. And then I was wandering around in a used bookstore in the early 90s, and I just pulled this book off the shelf. I was looking for something to read. It was historical fiction, and it had a violinist on the front, and then there were some Nazi flags in the background. And so I saw this violinist. I'm like, well, of course I want to read this book. It's about a violinist. And that was my first introduction through this well-researched historical fiction about what was happening to musicians during this particular time period. And so from that, then I explored Alma Rosé, because again, it was a violinist, and that's how I then led to the camps. And then the more I read, the more other wonderful, courageous people I began to encounter and their stories. And it just became more and more and bigger than I ever thought that it would.
Yeah. From Ted Thomas, the situation in Theresienstadt, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, my apologies, to the German speakers, points out the schizophrenia of the Nazi era. The Nazi officials who brutally condemned people to the hellish circumstances there had enough sophistication to know who the important musicians were so they could save them temporarily. And then he, if you have any comment to add to that.
Yes, we see that all through the study of the Holocaust, how there's this contradiction all of the time, how Dr. Mengele in Auschwitz could brutally kill and experiment on so many people. And then he would come into the barracks of the women's orchestra and ask Anita to play the cello for him. And he would weep with being moved over the beauty of the music. How did any of that make sense? He was also known to whistle great classical works while he was standing in line selecting who was going to the gas chamber and who wasn't. So there was this constant contradiction going on, and we certainly see it in Terezín, Theresienstadt, for sure, this twisted manipulation of music and of people, and everything seemed to be very calculated, very systemic to what they did.
Mm-hmm. Kind of a follow-up, another from Charlotte Anderson. Do you sometimes feel the fatigue of bearing witness as you have to follow, as you have followed kind of all these journeys?
Sometimes I do. And one of the things that has been sort of, I guess, unexpected for me is how deeply my heart has connected with all of these people and their stories and has not let go. I mean, I've been with their stories for a long time, and I feel like these people are my friends and family. I feel like I know them even though I never met them. And I still weep when I read their words. This afternoon, I wept on the back porch when I was preparing for tonight as I was choosing some of their words to read. You know, I was like, oh, I hope I can get through it tonight. I hope I can read their words without weeping, because sometimes I can't. Mm-hmm. But I also decided a long time ago, if I was going to research this, if there ever came a point where I was not moved by their story, where I had become kind of callous to it, that it was time for me to move on. And so thankfully, I'm not there yet.
Yeah. And on that note too, from Carrie Klofak, how long have you been researching this topic, and how long did it take you to write the book?
Thanks, Carrie. It's so great to have support of colleagues on here tonight. You know, my research started in just kind of an informal way, really, like 20 years ago. And so I just was reading a little bit here and there, and then I found out enough about Alma Rosé to write an article that got published. Then I spoke at a few conferences, and it wasn't until about 6 or 7 years ago that I began to seriously think, okay, this is a book now. And I began to shop a proposal around to a publisher and began researching and writing in earnest. So it was a pretty intense, about 5 or 6 years of really writing and every moment that I got and researching.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. The questions are rolling in. So from Jim Dahlman, did the musicians embed inside messages in their music in similar ways that slaves did in African-American spirituals?
Hi, Jim. Not in the same way that we think of the spirituals as sending coded messages, but there are definitely what we might say insider knowledge sometimes in the Yiddish folk songs or the theater productions they would do that the Nazis wouldn't understand what they were referring to. And there was even an experience in Terezín where they decided they were going to perform Verdi's Requiem. And it was just this unbelievable thing to think that you were going to perform a Catholic Requiem in a Jewish concentration camp. And they did, and they're singing it in Latin, and they get to the movement that's the Dies Irae, the Day of Wrath, and they were singing with all they had. They were pronouncing judgment on these people. And the Nazis didn't even know that they were standing there, and that's why they were singing. So that's the spiritual resistance. That's what they were able to do.
Yeah. From Andrew Ford, is there a recording of that famed premiere broadcast performance of the Leningrad Symphony? And we may be even to ask if I would personally like to know of any of these performers or pieces.
Yeah. Hi, Andy. Thanks for your question. I'm not aware of a recording of that particular broadcast. It would seem like something ought to be available, but I haven't come across one. There are some later recordings of, I think, Elias Berg conducting it again. But there are lots of recordings that are out there of composers' music that was written during the camps. And so a search through Spotify or through Apple Music will pull up, if you search for Holocaust music, or if you began to look around for composers who were in concentration camps, you can get some names and search that way. There's been a renewed interest in making sure that this music gets performed and it gets heard.
Wonderful. From Kayla Walker Eden, I often hear music in the arts in 21st century America described as extracurricular, always the first thing cut when school budgets and the like become tight. I hear these survivors saying things like music is life, and I am wondering how we have gotten to this point in 2020 of devaluing the arts and how we discuss them and how we prioritize our resources. I would love to hear Dr. Brown speak to this as both author and educator.
Well, Kayla, give me a hard question there. Let me solve that problem. But you're right. What you're seeing is the value of the arts looks totally different today than it did during that time period. We know that less and less students take music lessons, take piano lessons, right? They're more likely to be soccer players or video game players than taking piano lessons and violin lessons. There are exceptions to that. Some countries have more arts participation, Canada for one, Japan for another. So I think what has to happen is the culture has to change. All you have to do is flip through cable TV stations and count how many stations are devoted to sports and how many are devoted to the arts. And that shows you what our culture values. I can watch an old golf match from 30 years ago if I want to, but it's very hard to see something that's arts programming. So that has to change. And the way that gets changed is it has to change in the leadership of countries. It has to be valued. The people that we elect have to value the arts. They need to have experienced the arts themselves. If the arts are important, have been part of their heart and their life, then they're not as likely to say, okay, we're gonna cut the National Endowment of the Arts. And then this has a trickle-down effect. When the leadership believes in it, then it's less likely that schools are going to cut it. So we need a change of our culture from the very top.
Mm-hmm. I got so engrossed in that. I was like, oh yeah, I have to read questions. Okay, so our next question, again from Dr. Thomas, would you share with everyone what you have written about how the musicians had such varying attitudes toward the music they produced? Some of them seem to have hated what they were doing. others welcomed their musical assignments.
Yeah, it was an interesting thing to read in the research about how some people responded. Some people responded that music was so integral to their lives that they were going to play it no matter if they were being forced to play it. Others reacted in a way that they did not want their music to be dictated in this way. They felt like that, I don't know, it was poisoning something that was precious to them. There was one occasion in Auschwitz when a French prisoner was being hung, and they forced one of the violinists to come and stand there and play the French national anthem while this man was being hung. And he couldn't live with himself for having had his music used in that way, and he committed suicide. There were some musicians that after they got out of the camps, they never played music again. There were some who went on, like Anita, and she was a founder of the English Chamber Orchestra, and music remained a part of her life. So it was a very individual thing.
To wrap this up and maybe kind of end on maybe a lighter note, perhaps, what has been the most rewarding part of this research project for you?
It really has been the connections that I have been able to make with people. Through the research, I have made so many wonderful friends and relationships. I have met with family members of Holocaust survivors, and it has enriched my life so much to get to know them and to hear their stories, and just all the different people all around the world that I have had conversations with and who've shared their stories. And so that has been so uplifting to me. And I've just been so honored to be able to meet these people and tell these stories.
Thank you. Well, thank you again to Mary Jackson for assisting me, and thank you, Kellie, for sharing your work and heart with us. I personally was moved. It sounds like a lot of us listening were also moved.
Yeah, I'm so grateful for everyone joining me tonight. Thank you all, friends and family and colleagues. And Alicia and Mary, I appreciate so much all the work that you've done to help make this possible.
Yes. Yeah, thank you again, everyone. Again, the book is out. It is available. And also a video of this, we've been recording this, so it'll be made available. We should be posting it, I believe, in the Facebook Milligan University Libraries, and also on our Milligan University YouTube page. So if you want to share it with others or come back to it later, spread the word. And thank you all. Have a wonderful night.
Good night.